Welcome back to the Deep Dive, where we crack open a stack of sources and pull out the most important nuggets of knowledge to help you get well-informed fast. Today, we're delving into a truly provocative work from a really pivotal moment in history, 1941, right in the thick of World War II.
That's right. Our source for this deep dive is The Managerial Revolution, What is Happening in the World by James Burnham. It's a book written, from the perspective of the early 1940s, trying to make sense of these monumental global shifts and arguing that the war was, well, far more than just a military conflict. He saw it as a social revolution.
And our mission today is to unpack Burnham's central, pretty radical argument that the world was then, and maybe still is, in the midst of a social revolution, but crucially not the one most people expected. So forget Marx's predicted worker uprising. Burnham saw something else entirely brewing beneath the surface.
It's something quite different.
We're going to explore his detailed breakdown of capitalism, his compelling reasons for why he believed it was ending, and his, let's face it, controversial predictions about what would replace it, this new managerial society.
Exactly, who the new rulers would be.
You'll learn what he saw as the driving forces behind this change, how it played out in places like Russia, Germany, even the United States, and what kind of future he envisioned. Prepare for some surprising facts and maybe some aha moments that might just make you see today's world a little differently.
It definitely offers a different lens.
So in 1941, the Second World War is raging. Many observers felt the ground shifting beneath their feet. They sensed it was more than just armies clashing. A deep, fundamental social revolution was underway. But pinpointing the nature of that revolution, that was the real challenge, wasn't it?
It really was. And Burnham explains that a social revolution isn't just, a minor policy adjustment or a tweak. It's drastic, fundamental transformation. We're talking about a complete overhaul of society's most important institutions.
Like what specifically?
Well, property relations, how economic production is actually carried on, the legal system, political organization. Think about the huge shift from medieval feudalism to modern capitalism. That's the changing kind, he stresses, not just degree.
Okay.
And along with these big institutional shifts, you also see parallel changes in cultural beliefs, how people understand their place in the world.
So he's saying the early 1940s was this incredibly rapid, almost dizzying period of social change. Leaving behind the society that had dominated for centuries and stepping into something entirely new, that's quite a claim to make in real time.
It truly was bold. And what's really crucial to understand about Burnham's analysis is his approach. He explicitly states he's not writing a program for social reform. He's not making moral judgments.
Right. He's trying to be objective.
Exactly. His goal is to lay out a descriptive theory, to explain the social transition happening around him and predict its outcome. And he insists it's based solely on the available evidence, not on whether he thinks it's good or bad.
And his focus was mainly on the big players.
Yeah, primarily the most important economic and political institutions, the widespread cultural beliefs, the ruling classes, mostly in what he considered the modern world, nations like England, the U.S., France, Germany.
Okay, let's unpack this. To get where Burnham thought the world was headed, we first need to grasp his view of capitalism itself. Which was pretty startling, right? He didn't see it as permanent at all.
Not at all. He saw it as a historically unique system with very specific and ultimately self-destructive traits. He argued that things we kind of take for granted about capitalism are actually quite unique to the last few centuries.
So what were those defining features he picked out?
Well, he identified several key characteristics that really set it apart from, say, feudalism. First, commodity production. The vast majority of goods are produced for exchange, for sale on a market, not for direct use by the producers themselves.
So it's not just about selling more stuff. It's a fundamental shift in why things are made.
Absolutely. A complete shift in purpose. It transformed labor and exchange at a foundational level. Second, the pervasive role of money. Money existed before, sure, but capitalism gives it this all-important, all-pervasive role. Complex banking, credit systems, these really took off in modern times. Back in the Middle Ages, lots of people never even saw money.
And money wasn't just for buying things anymore, was it? It got this almost magical power to make more money.
That's his third point.
Right.
Money is capital. Under capitalism, money is transformed into raw materials, machines, labor, then back into a greater amount of money. Profit, without breaking laws or morals.
Yeah.
This function was pretty minimal in other societies, mostly just for war or maybe conspicuous waste.
Okay. And number 4?
Fourth, capitalist economy is uniquely prone to periodic economic crises. These aren't caused by natural disasters or anything. They're crises of production, stemming directly from its own economic relations and forces.
So he didn't see these as just bumps in the road, but like a built-in flaw.
Precisely. An unavoidable feature. Fifth, production as a whole is regulated primarily by the market, internal and international, not by conscious, deliberate planning by any person or group. He thought such planning would kill the profit motive.
Right.
And finally, capitalism is defined by two main classes: the bourgeoisie, or capitalists who own the instruments of production, factories, mines, land, and hire labor, and the proletariat, or workers, who are free laborers, meaning they don't own any means of production, they just sell their labor for wages.
What's so interesting is that he points out how these features seems totally natural, totally permanent to people living then. But looking back, he says, nope, they're unique to just the last few hundred years. So beyond economics, how did this play out politically, ideologically?
Politically, he saw capitalist society characterized by a relatively large number of sovereign national states,
Yeah.
fixed borders, claiming absolute political autonomy. This wasn't like the default human way of organizing. And it was the first system with a true world scope, driven by this constant search for markets, raw materials, places to invest, which led to great powers dominating huge territories, colonies, spheres of influence.
A global system then, not just local
A
squad.
truly world system, yeah. Third, the state, government, army, courts, police had a deliberately limited range of activities. Its main job was keeping the peace at home, dealing with foreign relations, but otherwise mostly standing aside for the economy. That was the liberal theory of the state,
Yeah.
the state serving the capitalists, basically.
Part it.
And lastly, capitalist democracy, while it went further than previous forms, was never complete. It didn't really touch economic or social relations. It was restricted to only a part of the adult population. And it certainly wouldn't tolerate any serious challenge to capitalist institutions themselves.
And what about the ideas, the beliefs holding it all together? What was the ideological cement, as he put it?
Yeah, the cement. Well, ideologies typical of capitalism really emphasized individualism. The single human individual as the basic unit in everything, politics, psychology, morality, economics, understood as complete in himself.
Right, the rugged individual.
Exactly. And that went hand in hand with a strong stress on private initiative, seen as the engine of the economy, and doctrines of natural rights, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, free contract, all that. These ideas, Burnham says, were basically the glue holding the capitalist social fabric together. They justify the whole structure, the power of the ruling class.
Okay, so that's capitalism, according to Burnham. But then he argues its ending. In 1941, he saw these glaring signs pointing to its terminal decline, not just a recession, but something final. What were those signs?
Yeah, he presented what he saw as pretty compelling evidence for its inability to carry on. First, mass unemployment. He argued there was not the slightest prospect of ridding capitalism of mass unemployment, period. Even total war hadn't ended it in England and France, and he predicted it wouldn't in the U.S. either. Because any real solution, he thought, led outside the capitalist framework.
Wow. Okay, what else?
Second, unmanageable debt. Public and private debt had just ballooned to a point where it couldn't be handled. Without, massive bankruptcy or inflation that would just tear apart all capitalist institutions. It was like a constant drain on the system's bloodstream, he said.
So it wasn't just temporary downturns, but a structural inability to recover without self-destructing.
That was his argument, precisely. Third, the inability to manage backward sections. The great capitalist nations just weren't able to profitably exploit and develop the less developed parts of the world anymore. Even though he argued it was an imperious necessity for their survival. He used the U.S. and South America as an example. And finally, maybe most symptomatically, was the impotence of capitalist ideologies. The very ideas that held the society together, they'd lost their power. They'd become impotent. People just didn't truly believe them anymore.
How did he see that playing out?
He pointed to the abject failure of voluntary military enlistment in Britain and the U.S. in 1940, even with all the unemployment. The youth weren't enthusiastic, and even the capitalists themselves, the bourgeoisie, had lost confidence in its own ideologies. He saw things like the Munich appeasement policy as evidence of that loss of faith.
Okay, so capitalism's crumbling. The obvious next step for many, especially Marxists, were socialism, right? The workers take over. But Burnham, he had a completely different take, much more cynical.
Oh, absolutely. He fundamentally rejected the idea that socialism was the only alternative. Logically, he said, there are infinite alternatives. But his main focus was on the evidence that socialism wouldn't replace capitalism. And he drew heavily from the Russian experiment.
Right, the Soviet Union. What did he see there that convinced him socialism wasn't the future?
Well, he observed that the Russian Revolutionary Society, even though it abolished private property, developed in a direction that was plainly contrary to socialist ideals. Ideals like classlessness, freedom, internationalism, they just weren't materializing.
What specifically did he point to in Russia?
He saw a new, sharp class stratification emerging along economic lines. The top 10–12% of the Soviet population got about 50% of the national income. That was a sharper differentiation than in the U.S. at the time.
Wow, really?
Yeah. Plus an extreme lack of freedom. Every bit of freedom and democracy was purged, leading to, well, an extreme tyranny. And third, an ever-growing nationalism replaced the original internationalist ideals. It eventually became even stronger than under the czars.
Hmm. And what about that core socialist idea, workers' control of industry? That was a huge slogan early on.
He points out the irony there. That slogan was great for rallying the masses against the capitalists. But once the new state was set up, it was quickly abandoned. Lenin himself, Burnham notes, argued the manager had to be a dictator in the factory. So workers' democracy in the state was actually founded on managerial dictatorship in production. Yeah. Quite a contradiction.
That really is. Were there other signs for him beyond Russia?
Definitely. For one, the expected socialist revolutions just didn't happen or succeed elsewhere. Not in Germany, not in the Balkans, not in China, even when conditions seemed ripe. Also, Marx's prediction of proletarianization, everyone becoming a worker, didn't fully pan out.
Yeah.
New middle classes emerged, independent producers, and crucially, changes in technology, both industrial and military, actually weakened worker power.
How so?
Modern production became much more complex, needing specialized skills from engineers, managers, and modern warfare with tanks, planes, required significant training. Workers couldn't just by themselves run the productive machine or effectively fight a war anymore. This weakened their social position, their revolutionary potential.
Okay.
And lastly, he pointed out that even where reformist Marxist parties governed in Europe, they consistently failed to actually introduce socialism.
Yeah.
And the revolutionary wings, they proved unable to take and hold power anywhere else.
So, okay, capitalism is dissolving. Socialism isn't the replacement. What is this new society Burnham predicts? What fills the vacuum?
Right. This leads us straight to his core theory, the Managerial Revolution. He asserts that modern society is undergoing this rapid fundamental transformation from capitalist to managerial society. And this new structure will have different economic, social, political institutions, new ideologies, and a new dominant ruling class, the managers.
The managers. Who exactly are they in his definition? It sounds like it could cover a lot of people.
He's actually quite specific. He distinguishes 4 groups, noting that in big modern corporations, these functions are usually separate. First, and his main focus, are the managers themselves. These are the people responsible for the technical direction and coordination of production.
So the engineers, the production supervisors, the administrators.
Exactly. The production managers, operating executives, superintendents, administrative engineers, maybe bureau heads in government. Their job is about how things are made and run. Then you have the finance executives. They're focused on profit, prices, financing. More the financial health of the company, less the technical process.
Okay.
Third, the finance capitalists. These are the big players, directors, bankers, financiers involved in many companies, market operations, mergers, stock issues, political influence, the most privileged under capitalism. And finally, the passive stockholders, the legal owners who just hold stock certificates and get dividends, but have an entirely passive relation to the actual business.
That's a helpful breakdown. And the crucial point is that the manager's power comes from something different than the finance capitalists, right?
Precisely. He stresses that the manager's position, their function, is tied to the technical nature of modern production itself. It's about know-how. The finance capitalists, though, their power is entirely bound up with capitalist property relations, with ownership in the traditional sense. And this creates a fundamental conflict. Managers start to see the finance guys getting these huge rewards for basically not doing any necessary production work.
This connects to that idea people were already talking about back then, the separation of ownership and control in corporations. Burwell and Means wrote about it. How did Burnham see that?
He had a very sharp take on it. Burnham argues that, sociologically speaking, separation of ownership and control is actually meaningless. Because for him, ownership means control. Full stop. If you don't have control, you don't really have ownership.
So what are the key parts of ownership then?
2 things, mainly. 1, control over access to the object. Like, can you keep others out of your factory or house? And 2, preferential treatment in the distribution of its products? Do you get the primary benefits? He says if control is truly separated from ownership, then ownership has simply shifted to the group that has the control.
Ah, okay.
The separation is just a temporary phase, an imbalance, where the finance capitalists, who get preferential treatment, are losing control over access, while the managers, who increasingly control access and operations, are gaining it. And historically, control over access is decisive. Once that's consolidated, real ownership shifts to the new dominant class, the managers. That, he says, is the managerial revolution happening.
Okay, so if managers become the new ruling class, what does the economy of this managerial society actually look like? How does it function day to day?
Well, he predicted an economy based on state ownership of the major instruments of production. But the state itself would be controlled by and act primarily in the interests of the managers. He called it an exploiting economy. And again, we need to stress he used exploiting in a neutral descriptive sense, just meaning unequal distribution.
Right, not a moral judgment, just that some group gets a bigger slice of the pie.
Exactly. Any class society, for him, involves that. But how does it work here? Managers, because they control the state, which has a monopoly on production, can essentially fix prices above costs. This leaves huge funds for the state and, by extension, for the managers themselves. Money stops functioning as private capital. Capital comes almost entirely from the state.
So industries don't need to chase profit in the capitalist sense anymore.
Correct. Production can be directed towards other goals: war, raising mass living standards, national prestige, whatever the state decides, all managed through centralized state direction, managed currency, state control of foreign trade, maybe even compulsory labor.
And money itself changes. You mentioned that striking image he used.
Yeah, the role of money gets considerably restricted, less used in direct exchange. More real income comes in non-monetary forms, state-provided services like roads, water, education, healthcare. He predicted money would become increasingly detached from any metallic base, like gold, that Fort Knox gold pile. He mused it might just become a monument for posterity, like the Egyptian pyramids.
Wow, that really paints a picture of a fundamental shift. What about the workers in the system? Are they still free laborers?
Well, their freedom to sell labor to competing employers largely vanishes, because there's basically only one major employer, the state. Job assignments, transfers, pay rates, all centrally determined. This economy wouldn't have capitalist-style crises of overproduction, he thought, but it would have its own crises, maybe technical breakdowns in the bureaucracy or political crises from mass dissatisfaction.
But it could solve some of capitalism's big problems.
That was his point. It could solve mass unemployment. He saw Russia and Germany doing this by 1941. It could potentially resume long-term production growth, and it allowed for centralized planning of the whole economy, which capitalism couldn't really do.
And the state itself, the political system, how does this managerial class actually rule?
The old limited capitalist state gets thrown out, replaced by an unlimited state that gets involved in more and more of the economy. Government enterprise grows rapidly. He pointed to things like the WPA, the CCC, huge state investments even back then.
And where does the actual power lie?
Sovereignty, he argued, slips away from parliaments, the typical capitalist institution. It starts to localize in these administrative boards, commissions, bureaus. They become the real lawmakers because they direct the important state activities. Running steel plants, he said, is more influential now than just punishing murderers.
So the power shifts to the technocrats, the administrators behind the scenes almost.
That's the idea. And he noted that the countries furthest down this managerial path, Russia, Germany, Italy, were totalitarian dictatorships. He didn't think totalitarianism was just a random political choice. He thought modern technology, like fast communication transport, enabled it, and is maybe the defining form of this transition period. He cautioned against just making moral judgments, stressing the need to understand scientifically what kind of society was being totalitarianized and who benefited.
Did he think totalitarianism was permanent, though, or just part of the transition?
He drew parallels to those ruthless dictatorships back in the 16th, 17th centuries, during the shift from feudalism to capitalism. Think Henry VIII, divine right of kings. Rough times. So Burnham suggested totalitarianism might be a temporary phase. He argued that eventually managerial society would probably need some form of limited democracy just to function efficiently. Managers need accurate feedback from the public for planning, but without threatening their fundamental control.
Okay, and what about the ideas, the ideologies that hold this new society together? If it's not traditional liberalism, what is it?
Managerial ideologies, he says, are explicitly anti-capitalist. They use different themes. Instead of the individual, the stress is on the state, people, folk, race. Instead of gold, it's labor and work. Instead of private enterprise, it's socialism or collectivism. Less talk about rights, more about duties, order, discipline, jobs. They also bring back themes like destiny, the future, sacrifice, power.
And these ideas are more effective than the old ones.
He argued their mass appeal by 1941 was far greater. They actively undermined confidence in capitalist ideas. Capitalist slogans had just lost their power. Look at Hitler's rise, or the indifference of youth in the U.S. and Britain.
And this is where he makes that really controversial connection, lumping together systems that seem totally opposed.
He does. It's probably his most provocative claim, that Stalinism, Nazism, and even New Dealism, despite all their obvious massive differences, were all managerial ideologies, all sharing a common historical direction away from capitalism and toward managerial society.
Wow. Equating the New Deal with Nazism and Stalinism, even just in terms of direction, how did he justify that? What was the common thread?
He argued that communist and fascist thinkers, practically speaking, had almost identical critiques of capitalism, its economy, politics, ideology. They both scorned capitalist morality, natural rights, attacked individualism, and both emphasized concepts like state, collectivity, planning, coordination, discipline. Their whole concept of the state, he thought, was basically generalized from the experience of managing a big factory or organization.
Okay, but the New Deal, how did that fit in? It seems so different.
He saw New Dealism as, well, more primitive, still retaining more capitalist bits, but pointing the same way. It undermined old capitalist institutions, it helped managers rise, it kind of curbed the masses. For example, by tying unions more closely to the state, pushing the idea of an indispensable leader, and appealing directly to production men and managers in speeches, but pointedly not to businessmen. He even saw things like the technocracy movement as another American version of this managerial thinking.
This whole transformation sounds absolutely immense. What did he predict it would mean for international relations, for global power?
A radical shift. He said the old capitalist system, with lots of sovereign states all competing, just couldn't continue. It was collapsing. It would be replaced by a relatively small number of great nations or super-states, which would divide the world between them.
Superstates, where would they be based?
He theorized they'd naturally form around the world's three main areas of advanced industry. One, a North American center based on the U.S. Two, a European center based on Germany's industrial power. And three, an Asiatic center based around Japan and parts of eastern China.
So fewer nations, but these massive power blocks. That sounds almost like science fiction, but he wrote this in 41.
It was a truly radical reimagining of the world map. And he believed future wars would mainly be conflicts between these managerial superstates, fighting over shares of the rest of the world. He even argued that the first part of WWII, up to France's fall in 1940, had essentially completed the consolidation of the European base under Germany. He saw that as irreversible.
And the rest of the world. The less developed areas.
He thought they'd try to break free, but probably couldn't achieve real independence because they lacked the necessary technological resources. They'd eventually be subordinated to one of the superstates. Because, he argued, managerial economies could actually exploit these areas profitably, unlike dying capitalism.
What about the U.S. position back then, in 1941? Was it already heading down this managerial path?
He believed so. He said the U.S. was linked unbreakably with the rest of the modern world socially, even if militarily isolated for a time. He saw the U.S. as already on track to become the core of a superstate. Its hesitation was because it still had more capitalist baggage, but it would be compelled to go over to the managerial structure just to compete in this new world.
And how would that happen for the U.S.?
He predicted a war way. The U.S. would have to tackle the managerial problem, sidelining capitalists, controlling the masses, competing with rivals, pretty much all at once. Unlike Russia or Germany, its big crisis would happen right in the middle of war.
And wartime concessions to capitalists, does he think those would work? You mentioned cruel catches.
Yeah, he argued those concessions would be illusory. Modern total war, he said, is fundamentally unprofitable for capitalism. The real de facto control over production would inevitably shift further towards the managers and their allies in the bureaucracy and military. He pointed to things like the Office of Production Management, headed by a production man like William Knudsen, not a finance type, and anchored in the state, as proof. Capitalist institutions just weren't equipped to fight modern total war effectively, or even to rally popular morale adequately.
Burnham must have known this theory would get pushback. He anticipated objections, right? What were some key ones, and how did he respond?
He definitely did. He discusses several criticisms. One was the too vague, too precise issue. Some might say it lacks mathematical precision, exact dates, so it's too vague. Others might say its predictions are too bold, too precise. He basically acknowledged sociology isn't physics yet, but argued the theory was specific enough to be significant because it made observable, probable predictions about the future that set it apart from other theories, like capitalism continuing or socialism winning.
What about the argument that bureaucrats just can't rule? That they're just administrators, not a real ruling class?
Right, that was a common one, that bureaucrats are non-productive, just mediating between other classes. Burnham countered that modern bureaucracies, the ones emerging then, were totally different from old 19th century ones. These new bureaucrats were deeply involved in directing the biggest enterprises, controlling others, applying industrial and scientific methods. They weren't just shuffling papers, they were directing the biggest enterprises. They had real operational power.
Okay. And the extreme nationalism he described, wouldn't that just lead to constant, devastating wars between these superstates?
Critics definitely raise that point. Managerial nationalism seems like a recipe for perpetual conflict. Burnham actually agreed wars would continue, but he saw managerial nationalism as, weirdly, a kind of solution to capitalist nationalism, because it replaces many small, constantly squabbling states with just a few large superstates, and nationalism itself is flexible. German folk could become Europeans. U.S. hemisphere policy could expand. So this new world system, while still prone to war, might actually be stable enough for society to carry on.
And finally, what about the human element? Did critics say he ignored people's desires for freedom, for peace?
Yes, that criticism came up that he neglected what people want and feel. Burnham's response was basically that, yes, human wishes matter, they're part of history, but a good theory should also predict what people will wish and do, based on past experience and current conditions. He argued people often misread history because they focus on their hopes, not the objective evidence. And in the coming managerial society, even with its harshness, he believed the masses wouldn't tolerate going back to capitalism's problems, like mass unemployment. They would choose, maybe reluctantly, further advance along the managerial road.
And he left us with a key point about proving him wrong, didn't he?
He did. A critical methodological point. To disprove his theory, you can't just show it's not 100% certain. You have to demonstrate that an alternative theory like capitalism lasting forever, or socialism finally triumphing, is actually more probable based on the evidence available. And for Burnham, writing in 1941, the Managerial Revolution looked quite chillingly like the most probable outcome. So Burnham's analysis, written right in the thick of World War II, painted this picture of a world undergoing profound, irreversible change. He argued capitalism was ending, but not making way for socialism. Instead, a new, often totalitarian, managerial society was emerging, dominated by those who held the real technical control over production, not just the legal titles of ownership.
It's a really fascinating and, yeah, in some ways, quite unsettling prediction. Thinking about the world now, almost a century after he wrote The Managerial Revolution, what do you observe? How much of his vision, these superstates, planned economies, shifting alliances, the quiet rise of this manager class, do you actually see reflected today? What does it all say about how power, control, and ideology might have evolved, maybe in ways we don't always notice? It certainly gives you something to chew on when you look at our modern world, doesn't it?
It absolutely does.
That's all for this deep dive into James Burnham's The Managerial Revolution. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time for another journey into knowledge.